on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's emotional truthfulness. And if it doesn't have both of those things, it's not going to be an enduring work of art as such. Now, we have to think about art and literature and so on, and ask ourselves, whether it's being true to human nature, and if not, then it's just going to pass away. What might seem an odd comparison is this, that if you think back to the early 19th century, and Beethoven was writing very much at the height of his powers, and he wrote the Third Symphony, and he dedicated it to Napoleon Bonaparte. Well, how important is that? That's not really important. The fact of the matter is that Napoleon passed away, but the Third Symphony is still with us. And that's really, in a way, what I'd like to point out. So let's take a look at some pictures here. So I'm going to, all right. Okay. All right, so let's go to slideshow. Now, I'm going to show you two pieces of sculpture right off that are really classic monuments. I don't know how many Lenins there were that were made and put up, thousands, I imagine, all over Eastern Europe. And here's one of them in Russia that's on the way out. And why is it on the way out? Well, first of all, it's not a work of art we're saving, but what's important is that the political climate changed, and therefore the piece of sculpture became worthless to the authorities. And here's another piece of sculpture. This is a Confederate general on horseback, and he's on the way out too, because in fact, these sculptures were put up for Jim Crow, and Jim Crow, at least one hopes, is on the way out. So it's on the way out. So both of them have gotten the sling, the most literal way. Now, the first piece of sculpture that I want to talk about in any detail here is the Marcus Aurelius that's in Rome. It's interesting, by the way, that every Roman emperor had such a statue made of himself on horseback, but all of them have disappeared except this one. And this really is a very beautiful piece of sculpture. This is the copy, which is outside the Capitol Line Museum. And the original is inside the museum, somewhat different in terms of its patina. And the first thing I want to say about it is this: as a work of art, as a work of sculpture, it's just an extraordinary piece. And the way I would put this is, every single square centimeter of this piece of sculpture is alive and pulsing. Whoever made it, we don't know who made it, really knew what they were doing as a sculptor, and they brought this inert material here of bronze really extraordinarily to life from a formal point of view. But what is the sculpture saying? Well, I'm reminded of Mary Beard's remark that the more you look into it, the more it turns out that the Roman emperors were all genocidal maniacs. And that was probably as true of Marcus Aurelius as the rest. But there is an official story here. Marcus Aurelius claimed to be a Stoic philosopher, and many of us have his meditations. I've still got a copy on my bookcase, and I look at it occasionally. And what is Stoicism about? It's about self-control, and it's about self-containment, and it's about not, if you want to put it crudely, flying off the handle all the time. And that's really what this face is saying for us. Now, it's not, by the way, that the Romans always made faces that looked idealized as Marcus Aurelius does here. They were extraordinary sculptors, and we have a lot of heads that they have left behind of important people that are all too truthful. I don't know who this person was, but I think everybody would agree, taking a look at it, that he's a very human person right here. I mean, you know, they're showing him warts and all. That's a very important thing. So they could have made the Marcus Aurelius look like the real Marcus Aurelius. I doubt very much after all that campaigning that he looked anything at all like that. But they didn't go there. They idealized him, and so they were making him an exemplar of Stoic philosophy. Now, this is a piece of sculpture by Augustus St. Gaudens, and one reason I selected it is that those of us that have a New York connection, as most people who went to Columbia do, have probably seen this at 59th and 5th. This is Victory leading Sherman, and this, you see it very shiny here because it's been regilded. I dare say that the thousands and thousands of people that walk by this every day, not 1 out of 100 actually stops and takes a look at it and looks closely at it. But it is actually a very beautiful piece of sculpture in its own right as a piece of sculpture, and it also says something that's interesting, and it's an enduring thing. Here's another view of it. And I want to show you Sherman's face because he's a very grim person. The story is that he came to St. Gaudens' studio to sit for this memorial, and St. Gaudens asked him to button up his tunic, and he just said he wasn't going to do it. And so, as with some of the pictures of Winston Churchill that show him with a grimace, it's the same kind of thing here. He really pictures this person as a real person. Now, you know, let's be clear about this. You don't become a general if you don't have a ruthless streak in you. And Sherman oversaw numerous battles, and he didn't hold back his hand at all. I mean, he smoked them very much. And his most famous quote is, "War is hell." But it somehow seems like it's more than that when you really look at it. In other words, here's this actual person. Here are 2 views of the study bust that St. Gaudens made of this man. And he looks worn, and as I say, grim. And I think there's 2 things going on here. One is that Sherman himself was a very ruthless general. But to me, something else that I think we should think about is when this sculpture was made in the late 19th century, the northern states had become sort of overwhelmed, in a sense, by rising industrial capitalism, which was itself a very ruthless, I dare say almost grim economic system. And I think that another way of looking at this is to see Sherman as an embodiment of that ruthlessness. There's nothing romantic about this man, and there's nothing romantic about the system where millions of people left their farms or immigrated from Europe to work and toil in the factories. something else that I found very amusing, which I really didn't know, but I found it in the course of doing the research for this talk. That is, it turns out that the victory is an actual person. I always just assumed when I saw it that she was another example of the Venus figures that we see so much of in the last 4,000 or 5,000 years of sculpture, an idealized woman. But when it was unveiled, the people who knew this woman said that it was her. And who was it? It turns out that Sherman had a niece named Elizabeth Sherman. She married a wealthy senator, and she spent most of her life in Paris, where she became friends with Edith Wharton and with Henry James and with John Singer Sargent, and also with Augustus St. Gaudens. And he didn't have her sickle, we don't have a study bust, but he evidently decided to put her face on there. And I think there's a striking resemblance here between them. So I think that her friends were right. Now, I think this particular piece of sculpture, this is the Shaw Memorial on the Boston Commons, is one of the most remarkable pieces of sculpture ever made in the United States. And if you've ever seen the movie Glory, it's about this. So Shaw was 25 years old. He was a colonel. This shows him leading his men in an assault in South Carolina. And he died in the assault, and most of his men died. There were very few survivors from this attack. The Massachusetts 54th was, as they called it in those days, a colored regiment. It's the first colored regiment, first regiment in the American Army that welcomed African American soldiers. And here they are. And there's a number of things that are really vital about this that I'd like to call your attention to. One is this. Take a look at these legs, and you see they're very regular here, and they're coming forward with a very determined tread. But at the same time, take a look at the rifles behind them. And those rifles are rather irregular. And I think it was St. Gaudens' way of saying that every man was in his own thoughts. They must have all known that nearly all of them would die. And rather than it being like a straightforward war memorial, everybody here is a hero, he's trying to show you the humanness of them. Here's another one. You see how irregular these rifles are. And you also see, if you look closely, that their eyes are downcast. But they're walking forward. They're doing what they are supposed to do. You see from their legs that they're marching in a very determined way. But they knew what they were doing, and they knew that most likely they wouldn't survive, and that was true. I have to say, by the way, the interesting thing is, if you take a look at this horse, the horse looks absolutely terrified. The colonel doesn't. He just looks very foreboding, but the horse looks terrified. Now, all of the soldiers that he pictures here are individuals, and that's important. They're not just a type. St. Gaudens went out on the streets of New York. This was in the 1890s, 30 years after the war. He couldn't find any of the survivors of the regiment, if there were any. And he recruited African-American men to come and sit in the studio so that he could make portraits that would be real, true to life. And here's on the left, the study bust for Robert Gould Shaw, and here on the left, a study bust that he made for some of the soldiers. Here's two more. They're beautiful pieces of sculpture in and of themselves, and still more. I think he did altogether 40 study busts of African American men, so that when he made the sculpture, it would be in some important way true to life. I couldn't resist putting this quote in, by the way. I think it's wonderful, and it does say something about what art actually is. So what garlic is to salad, insanity is to art. Now I want to show you a few shots of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which I myself personally found very moving, and I went there at night, so I found this picture of it at night. And many of us have been there and we're familiar with it, but just to summarize, it's a long, polished wall of black marble with the names cut into it of the fallen, and it's done by the order of their death, not by their alphabetical order. And there's two things going on here that are important. One, of course, is the names, but the other thing is the reflection. So the people who are there taking a look at it become part of the memorial. I think this is, by the way, one of the most successful pieces of public art ever done, actually. But I may feel that way partly because I actually know somebody, or knew someone, who's on the wall, who died in 1968, second lieutenant in the Marines. Thought this was very moving. I don't know what's going on there, except it looks like someone has finally located the name of a friend of his. And here they are. You see people, a lot of people just instinctively reach out and touch this piece of sculpture. So, now, I'm going to talk, at least briefly, about three of my own pieces of sculpture, which you might find of interest. The first one is called the Amy Fretz Memorial. And the situation is that the Mennonite Church in Kansas City, Kansas, wanted some kind of a memorial to this little girl. She was born at the age of 6. She spent her entire life in a wheelchair. I don't believe she ever learned how to speak. But her family said that she was really a pretty cheerful person despite it all, and she just died of accumulated problems that she had. And I proposed to them that we make something for children in wheelchairs, and they said that would be great. I happened to be working at the Exploratorium in San Francisco at that time, and I had a consultant that the Exploratorium arranged for me, who was a young woman who was a member of a dance troupe, and she was quadriplegic. And I asked her to give me some advice. And what she said was, think about rumble strips as a possibility, because even the most severely disabled person will still have some kind of kinesthetic sense. So that's essentially what this is. Now, it does have her name in it, Amy here, and in stainless steel. And you can see what the scale of it is. It's made in a child-size scale. Here's the dedication. And here you can see the rumble strip idea where we use the grooving. The grooving is much further apart at the ends of the sculpture than it is in the center. And so as you approach the center of it, it becomes a more intense experience. And this, I thought, this reflects something that the young woman in San Francisco was telling me. She showed me videos of her dance performances, and they involved her being in a wheelchair and people would tilt her back. And I thought the idea of the tilting back for someone in a wheelchair, if they had somebody with them, would be a nice thing to make reference to. Then there's these other shapes to it, which are playful. I mean, it is part of a playground after all. Now, I think that this, by the way, is an important part of it. The state of Kansas came up with a little grant for us, but basically this church raised the money by selling cups. So it was very much a homegrown effort here. Now here's a project that's in northwestern Ohio in Bowling Green. And I went there, and there's something very interesting about this area, which is that, as you know, Ohio came into the Union in 1803, but this area was not settled until the 1880s. Well, how is that possible? I mean, California came in 1850 after all. Well, what it was that the whole area was this tangled swamp called the Black Swamp. And it was just too difficult a place for people to farm. And eventually by the 1880s, they tiled the fields and they were able to get the water off of it and turn it into farmland. And so the sculpture has several levels here. In the largest level, you see the shapes of the swamp, kind of shadows of the swamp, in black and white. And then you see that they spiral and then they resolve into the grid pattern that you see in the fields now. And then here for scale are people walking. It's very much in a public place. There's 10,000 crossings a day on this. And here's the swamp area from ground level. And I went to the brick plant. Well, first, I went into the field. I found two tiny parts of the original Black Swamp. And I collected leaves from the trees that are still there. And so these leaves that you see in the drawn into the brick, there's 1,000 of them that are individual, are all different one from another. I mean, all the bricks are different, but they show 4 different species of leaves. And I hope that if the students are paying attention, they're taking a close look, they might notice that the leaves are not the same leaves that they see in the trees around them. And so it's a memory piece for the now missing landscape, the Black Swamp that once covered much of northwestern Ohio. And here's another view of that. So now the last piece that I want to show you is at William Woods University, which is in central Missouri, and they had never had anything that acted as a visual center for their campus. And so the first requirement was to come up with something that people could experience, walking, traveling way that would act as a sort of central area for the campus, to create an entrance to, this is the auditorium over here, and a plaza area in front of it, tie it into the main walkway, create a little bit of a outdoor classroom area and a seating area with, place for people to relax and so on. What was to be the theme? Well, I spent some time at the campus and I finally found out something, which is that once a year they have this thing called the Ivy Ceremony, where incoming and departing students have you might say a parade or something, and they have a long strand of ivy that's laid over their shoulders. And so the form language derives from that, and the memorial purpose of the piece of sculpture is to show people in an ongoing visual way something that's just an annual ceremony. And by the way, I will say, add to that you can't see the whole, somebody at the university was kind enough to lean out of a small plane and take this picture for me. But otherwise, I'd be unable to show you the whole thing. You're not supposed to, in fact, see all of it, but you experience it unfolding in time as, in fact, you would experience a piece of music. So here is at one end of it, someone's entering there and walking, and you can see the seating area, and every part of it, in one way or another, has something to do with ivy forms. This is a highly geometric abstraction of the ivy form. Here's a sculpture that creates a, well, you can't actually see it here, but there's another entrance, and so that ivy sculpture flanks the entrance of the small door that's there. Then if you come down and you come around, you see the plaza area. Here's the steps. And here are the flanking sculptures for the steps that are ivy forms, highly abstracted, but still, I trust, highly readable, so to speak. And here's the plaza area. This is the ivy form done in the most geometric possible way. And here's the a detail there. And then I've been interested all my life actually in quilt forms. I think they're a very profound art form, an important way to get at certain design ideas, the way quilts are made. And so I invented an ivy quilt, which we put in. And this is about 12 meters long. And you can see black and red here with alternating patches of black and red that create two ivy forms that back up against each other. And then finally, as you come down off of the plaza, a set of ivy forms leading down to the lake. And this is 25 centimeters. And what this is the developing ivy forms from the bud to the juvenile form of the leaf to the complete form of the leaf. And I made a stamp that's this thing, it's a urethane stamp. And I gave it to the university with the idea that as they replay inside, they would have almost done here. As they replace the sidewalks, thank you, Arun. They can use this stamp. So eventually it will be propagated all over the campus, in every part of the campus. And then you'll come into the central sculpture. So that's my presentation. I guess I'm going to hit escape here. And if we have any questions, if anybody has any questions they want to put into the chat, I'd be happy to see what I can do. But anyhow, that's the basic things that I have to say. No. Okay. So, Arun, do we have anybody who's asked any questions or?
Thank you, William. Yeah. So far, no. We haven't got any questions. Let's give everybody a couple of minutes so that if you have any questions, you can chat it over, provide it in a window, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Okay. Now, how do I?
So you should find something like a stop screen share on the top. You just have to click on that. It's a red button. on the top.
Okay, stop share. I got it. Okay, there you go. How about that? All will be known. Very good. Okay. So, if anybody has
So, yep,
any
we have
questions,
some questions coming in. Let's give another minute or so, and
okay.
then I'll ask the question. Yep.
You could have a conclusion. Conclusion.
Oh, nice.
To conclude what you were arguing. Oh, right. Okay. Well, that's a thought. So I'll just end, by the way, by saying that I guess to try to summarize this, from the time I was very young, I was interested in sculpture, and I had this idea about it that it could escape time, which I think is the case. I think it does escape time because if it's worthwhile, like we know something about Marcus Aurelius because of the sculpture. We know something about the late 19th century, even if we knew nothing about its history by reading about it, we would know something by looking at the St. Gallen sculptures. And I dare say in the future we'll know something important about the Vietnam War because of the way that Maya Lin designed and oversaw the construction of that particular memorial. So I do have a question here, which I'll address, which is that.
So, yeah, William, there are some questions. Do you want me to just read through it one by one?
Yeah, I'll just read them or as you think appropriate of them. So.
Sure. Yeah. So the first question is, how have your appreciation for classical pieces you showed influence you?
Well, I think that time is a very powerful editor. And I think that works of art that have survived for many centuries have something to say to us because they've been through this filter. If they weren't worthwhile, no one would have taken care of them. And so ancient pieces of sculpture are of great interest to me because they have on them the hands and the thoughts of all the generations since the person who made them lived.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. They just would be gone. And in this case, they are here. And so it must mean that they mean something. Think about the Marcus Aurelius. All the other Roman emperor statues were melted down. This one was not. We don't know why, but we do know that after the 3rd century, Rome was overrun by the people they called the Goths, the barbarians, whatever, and they didn't lay a hand on this. They gathered up the others and they melted them down to the ponds, but they left this one alone. Why? Why did they do that? And I think it's because of the value of the piece of sculpture. It's really an important thing. And what was the value? Yeah, well, the value of it is this. And let me say something else. Lois and I are members of our subscribers to the LA Phil. So we hear these various talks. We went down there a couple of years ago and we heard John Adams, and he's as you know, a musical composer. And he said, I had to get to be 70 before I realized what I was doing. The most important thing I was doing was the emotional resonance of it. And I think that that's really true. Of course, his work started out in a very formal way, but the emotional resonance of it and those earlier pieces of sculpture really have a tremendous amount of emotional resonance. It doesn't matter that you're not a Roman senator or it doesn't really matter who you are. All you have to share with the maker of these ancient sculptures is the fact that both of you are human beings. Therefore, your emotional life is really pretty much the same from one person to another. Does that make sense? So anyhow, that's a stab at answering the question anyway. So
I'm seeing a couple of them nodding their heads, so I'm
okay,
assuming, yep, this is
all
good.
right.
Uh, I'll go to the next question. This is about, what do you think Southern or Civil War era monuments will be replaced with?
Ah, well, of course, I don't really know, right? But I do think that, you know, those monuments are made for a political purpose. That's why they were made. I mean, the Civil War, there were very few, I think this is important, there were very few monuments in the North, just a handful of them, really. But there were hundreds in the South. And why? Because the South was trying to retell the narrative of the war so that it didn't look like they fought the war to uphold slavery, which was, of course, what they actually did, but they wanted it to be like the glorious lost cause. And so these people were shown as very heroic, you know. Then they never would have shown someone with the kind of expression that St. Gaudens put on Sherman. I mean, that's the expression of somebody who doesn't care what you think, you know. It's like he's there, and that's what he told St. Gaudens when he showed up at his studio. He said, "No, I'm not going to button my tunic. I'm going to do what I want to do." And it was that spirit of I'm going to do what I want to do that animated the sculpture of him, and really, I think, was an important part of it. Meanwhile, in the South, you know, they had to show this sort of glorious cause. I have no idea what this is going to be replaced with, but I do know that this is in Montgomery, in Alabama. There's a monument or a memorial to the people who were lynched, and that, from the pictures I've seen, I think is very moving. And it may be something like that. I mean, that's much closer to the spirit of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial than the guys that are getting the sling, so to speak. You know, and so what I started out with is like, well, if you start thinking about a piece of sculpture that just has a political purpose, if the political ideas change, it's just worthless and it's just carried on. I did a project in Lithuania in 1995, and I drove by this enormous boneyard that showed all of these Lenins. There must have been hundreds of them out there. They've been taken off of pedestals all over Lithuania and carried to this place where they could be melted down. You know, and they were what? They were Lenins, right? And Lenin was not the reigning deity politically, so Lenin wasn't available any longer. They took him down. So, okay. Any other questions you think?
Yep. We have one more question. Your pieces are shown with an increasing use of color.
Yes.
Is that a chronological development?
Yes. They are in the chronological development, and I did get interested in the use of color as I went along. The Amy Memorial was a relatively early piece, and it was kind of rigorously done, and I was thinking of it in a much more abstract kind of way. Whereas with the other pieces, you know, there's a limited amount of color palette if you're working with paving brick and colored concrete and so on. I mean, you can't get too radical, but I do think that the color helps it quite a little bit. And you know, the goal really is to make a work of art that's in this public place that people will enjoy and that they want to spend time with. So if I have time for another quick little story, I'll just mention something, and that is that The piece in Bowling Green was down at a low point, and so we had to put storm drains in there. I didn't put them in, but then I put earth forms around it. And then one day, this man came and he said he was the contractor for the storm drains. And would I mind if he came back and he reset the grates so that they matched the earthwork? And I said, that would be great. And so he did. And then I painted them so that they would match. And then he came back to see the job when it was finished. And he said, no one looks at my work. I build storm sewers. That's what I do. No one ever sees it. No one cares about it. But people are going to look at this, and I want to be able to bring my grandchildren out here to see it. And I thought, yeah, to me, that's success. Success is when you want to bring your grandchildren to see something. So, anyhow. Okay, well, that's all the questions we have.
There is one more question.
Oh, okay.
In your experience in global architecture, can you share your thoughts of use of memorials and monuments between East and West?
Well, you know, everybody has to start somewhere. And actually, I was really interested when I was a young person in Indian art. And so I've been to India a couple of times and spent time in the countryside and gone to temples, many of them out of the way temples. And I really have thought about Eastern art quite a little bit. And in a certain way, the Eastern sculpture, the Indian sculpture, has been at the core of what I've done because of its vitality and also because of a certain kind of simplicity that it has, because Indian art starts with the idea of a sphere and it develops from that. And that's kind of the way that it grows. It's like a very organic kind of thing. And although Indian sculpture does show recognizable human forms, I haven't been all that concerned with anatomy and that kind of issue. I think that Indian art is very much a kind of root, a kind of taproot for a lot of sculpture. Very powerful kind of sculpture. I don't know, whether the Egyptians knew anything of Indian sculpture. I mean, certainly Egyptian sculpture was a taproot for Greek sculpture, but sculpture is a tree. It just grows with many branches and many leaves on it. And yet they all communicate with the same root system, in my opinion. So I don't know whether that answers the question or not, but anyway, yeah, it's for myself, the Eastern sculpture is very important, although obviously I'm interested in what the Greeks and the Romans had to say as well. And then of course the Gothic sculptors. I think one of the greatest pieces of sculpture in the world is Chartres Cathedral. And if you've never seen it, add it to your list because it's definitely worth going and spending a day and just taking a look at the portal sculptures that are there and how strong and organic and how perfectly the architecture and the sculpture work together. So anyway, that's a sculptor's testament on the subject. So, okay.
So, we have another question come in since we have time.
Okay.
Can you take that question?
Yeah.
So, what direction or motivation is inspiring your work now?
Okay. Well, I'm in my mid-70s, and so I don't build any of these large projects again. And they just take so much effort and physical effort and social effort and financial effort and all the rest of that. So working in my studio. And what I've been most interested in lately is this. I love Los Angeles. And before January, okay, you know, in the before times, as they say, okay, when it was possible to travel around, you know, we went to concerts, we went to restaurants, and I would see people and interesting people. And there's so much diversity. And on my website, I have a few of these heads, and the heads are not portraits exactly. I don't know these people. I don't know. I don't take a picture of them. I don't do a drawing of them. I just see them, and if there's something of interest to them in them, you know, I will come back to the studio and I'll make a head of them, and then I paint it, and in a kind of Southern California touch, they're painted with the kind of lacquers that they use on motorcycles and hot rods and lowrider kind of colors. And so I think they have some of the vitality of Southern California there. I mean, I find Los Angeles is just a tremendously exciting place to just be there and just to walk around and see, you know, the whole world is in Los Angeles, and they're there, and I find it endlessly fascinating, the people who I just see in a restaurant or on the street or wherever they might be. You know? So that's what I'm working on now. Okay.
Any other questions, or do you have any, or like if you want to share your comments, you can unmute yourself and feel free to talk. Yeah.
Just to say thank you, Will. It was a delight to go on a journey, a visual journey through history and your career, all in an hour.
Right. Well, it's been an interesting journey, right? So anyhow, so thank you. Yeah. Okay.
We have one more question.
Oh, one more question. Okay.
Is the Vietnam Memorial an anti-war memorial?
I don't see it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a little hard to explain why precisely, but I think the question is this. To me, what the Vietnam Memorial says is these people lived and then they died. And they died in the process that maybe they didn't choose. I think many of them did not choose. And yet they did it. And their name should be written down. And I had a high school classmate who went to Yale and must have been in ROTC, because as soon as he got out of Yale, he went into the Marine Corps as an officer, and he was killed something like 20 days after he got there. And I mean, the waste of it is just absolutely incredible when I think about that. It's just heartbreaking. And I hope in the pictures that I showed that you could see the heartbreak of the people who came there, the pictures of those people, that they were heartbroken. And you know, sometimes you have to fight a war. I understand that, okay? I'm not a pacifist. And sometimes the war makes more sense. One war makes more sense than another. But death is death. And somebody losing their life at a young age, a young, healthy person, man or woman, you know, I'm a little bit touched by that because one of our daughters went into the military, and I see the kind of vitality that she brought to her time in the Army. She's out of the Army now, but let's put it this way. For our daughter, she enters into a kind of fraternity and sorority that you can only do if you're in the military. I was never in the military. I'm never going to be part of that. But the people on the wall were all there and really paid the price for it. And so that's what I think the Vietnam Memorial is about. I wish all memorials would start with the kind of loss that's involved, even if it's a war like the one against Hitler that had to be fought. I understand that. There are cases, but, people died. So anyhow, that's a long answer without, coming to a conclusion, but go and see it if you haven't seen it. I mean, it really is worth seeing. And go in the twilight, because that's really a good time to see it. You have a chance to meditate on what's happening there.
Well, thank you very much for walking through your experience through a beautiful presentation, and then patience and answering each of the questions precisely and as touching as they can be. So I really appreciate the time with you. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, and thank you everybody who came. Thanks very much, and thanks for your questions.
Thank you.
Thank
all.
you, Will. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll send out the recording. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Will.
Thanks, Will. It's wonderful. Bye-bye.